I am so thrilled to have all of you here this evening for our town hall series, The Critical Conversations in World Language Education. I'm Victoria Russell, and I'm the 2022 actual president. I'm also a professor of Spanish and foreign language education at Valdosta State University in Georgia. Before we get started, I have some people to thank. I want to thank Dr. Maria Carrera. Please give us a wave. She is the co-chair of the research committee for ACTFL. She's an ACTFL board member. Kate Paisani is her co-chair. I'm not sure if you're here, Kate. If you are, give us a wave. I'd like to give a deep thanks to Joe Valina, who's the ACTFL Director of Marketing and Membership, and to Dr. Celia Chomon Zamora, who is the Director of ACTFL Professional Learning and Certification. Without these people, we wouldn't have this wonderful series. I'd also like to give a shout out to our excellent Executive Director, Howie Berman. He's there, give us a wave coming from Maryland. So let's go ahead and get started with the next slide. I want to just briefly introduce you to this series. Can you advance the slide, Maria? Thank you. ACTFL has 5 pillars in our strategic plan. You can see them here on this slide: advocacy and outreach, diversity, equity, and inclusion, professional learning, research, and teacher recruitment and retention. Let's take a look at the next slide. We have selected what we feel are critical topics. The ACTFL board and committee chairs selected the topics and the panelists, and we selected a theme on each area of ACTFL strategic plan. We've had 2 already. Teacher recruitment and retention was in April. Diversity, equity, and inclusion was last month in May. And of course, tonight we have the research and assessment panel, which you're all here. And in August, we're going to have advocacy and outreach, advocating for change, how to be heard. And then in September, on the professional learning strand, we're going to be looking at the topic addressing identity, inclusive language in world language classrooms. Now, these webinars are not a one and done. You're going to have a chance to engage and participate for up to 3 months after the webinar ends. The recording will be available to you. Reflection questions that are written by our panelists will also be available to you. And at the end of this webinar, Celia is going to come on and explain to you how you can engage further by creating materials and resources for teachers that will be published by ACTFL and credited to you. So make sure you stay until the end so you can hear about those next steps. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide so we can, well, our topic is research-based strategies for supporting heritage learners in mixed classrooms. Now let's take a look at our panelists. They are Dr. Angelica Amezcua, Dr. Ana Fernandez Dobayo, Dr. Florencia Henshaw, and Dr. Alana Kubica. So let me just explain to you how this is going to work tonight. So at first, Florencia is going to come on and discuss the research on heritage language teaching in mixed classrooms. After that, Angelica and Ana are going to talk about strategies for teaching heritage learners in mixed classrooms in secondary and post-secondary settings. And then Alana is going to come on and talk about strategies for K-8 settings. When they are done, I'm going to ask Maria to come back on and field your questions. So you might want to write your questions down as the presenters are speaking, and then we're going to have time for questions and answers, which you'll write into the chat, and then Maria will field those for our presenters. We should have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers, and then Celia will come on and tell you those next steps. So that's how it's going to work tonight. Let me give you a little bit more information on our wonderful presenters. So in the order they're going to speak, we have Dr. Florencia Henshaw. So we can go ahead and show their bios now. She earned a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she is the Director of Advanced Spanish. She is an award-winning educator who has published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration, heritage language instruction, and research-based pedagogical practices. Then we have Dr. Angelica Amezcua, who is an assistant professor and director of the Spanish Heritage Language Program at the University of Washington. Angelica is also a researcher and an educator of Spanish heritage language who works in and outside the classroom towards reclaiming and promoting the use of Spanish in a society with low ethno-linguistics vitality. In her current research, she examines how university Spanish heritage language courses can play an important role in promoting the use of Spanish in the United States, counteracting the devaluation of minority languages and contributing to narrowing the Latinx student achievement gap. Dr. Ana Fernandez Tobayo is an associate professor and the director of the Spanish Second Language program at the University of Washington. Her area of specialization is applied linguistics with a focus on instructed second language acquisition, heritage language learning, and foreign language pedagogy. She has published on collaborative writing, languaging, and interaction between and among second and heritage language learners. Dr. Alana Kubica is a public school educator with experience in all levels of K through 12 schools. In her 25 years in the classroom, she has taught in dual language and bilingual classes in elementary schools. She's also taught Spanish in high school and now in middle school. In her current position, she has worked as an advocate for the community's Spanish-speaking students and established a Spanish for Spanish speakers program. It has grown in the past 5 years from 1 section to 5 full sections in 3 levels. She is passionate about working with students to develop their biliteracy skills. Every student enters her classroom with a promise and exits with a purpose. Without further ado, I'm going to call on Florencia to take it away with the research.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I only have 10 minutes, so I'll jump right to it. Maria, if you can go to the next slide. So when we're talking about research on mixed classes, by mixed classes, we say classes where both second language and heritage language learners are enrolled. There's been lots of research on it, but it varies widely in terms of what we're focusing on, how we're measuring things. So we still need more, we need more of this to replication studies, right? So looking at somewhat of the same context, do we find the same findings or not? And I'm going to simplify. I'm not going to unpack everything like I do in my videos. We're just going to simplify here 2 main strands. One that has looked at the interaction itself and peer collaboration. What happens when second language, heritage language learners work together? The other one focuses more on perceptions of the interaction, of the courses, etc. So let's go to the next slide to look at interactional patterns. When you look at research on interaction, you can look at the patterns itself, what happens while they're interacting, or you can look at what happens as an outcome of interaction. So in this slide, I'm only focusing on the interaction itself. The general pattern that everybody seems to be finding is that when it comes to language usefulness, if you will, learning opportunities that are language related, there are more learning opportunities for the second language learners than for the heritage language learners. That is a pattern that keeps coming up, keeps coming up, keeps coming up. Now, another way of looking at the interactional patterns is to look at what happens if mixed and matched dyads. So if you have L2HL versus L2L2, HLHL, right? So learners of the same background or different background. And what we find here is a little bit of a pattern, because we need more studies, but that matched pairs. So when a learner interacts with another learner of the same linguistic background, there tends to be more collaboration. It seems like they're more willing to work with each other, to seek help from each other, etc. And the graph that I showed there is from my 2015 study. And I like it because it shows the exact opposite for the L2 and the HL learners. And this study only looked at the mixed dyads and what's going on with mixed dyads. And what you can see there is essentially that the second language learners are the ones asking for help, and the heritage language learners are the ones providing the help. They provide corrections to the second language learner. So if we were only looking at who's initiating attention to form, it would look pretty even. But when you look at the type of attention to form that is being initiated, you see that difference where it is still more in favor of the second language learners. If we can go to the next slide. Now, that is just what's happening during the interaction. What happens after the interaction? Do they remember or do they apply what they have learned from their peers? A bit of a mixed bag here, and we need more studies. A lot of studies are just staying at the interaction. We need to know what happens after. So my 2015 study, the second language learners retained more information than the heritage language learners. The second language learners helped them. They gave them right information, but then the heritage learners decided not to use it when they were writing on their own. My colleague right here, right now, Dr. Fernandez Dobao, did not find any differences. So this is why we need more studies. And a more recent study, co-author between me and Lauren Hetrovics, they matched pairs, so 2 second language learners or 2 heritage language learners working together retained more than the mixed diets again. So there's something there that keeps coming back that for some reason, the mixed diets, we still need to figure them out. And that's why we're here. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's look at the studies that focused on perceptions. And these to me are the fascinating studies too. Interaction too, but perceptions I love. So the second language learners, some of the negative feelings that they express is that sometimes they feel intimidated or less confident or unhelpful when working with a heritage speaker, because they see them as a native speaker, they see them as knowing more. Of course, this is task dependent. It depends on what we're asking them to do. But even when they're working on writing something where the second language learner could help with spelling, or so we think, they still say that they're feeling less than, right? As opposed to when they work with a second language learner. Now, the heritage language learners, the early literature suggested that they could benefit because they could play the role of the expert. And actually what perception studies are showing is that this could be a myth, right? That the heritage speakers don't necessarily enjoy this role of expert. It could actually exacerbate their own linguistic insecurities, because if the second language learner is asking them a question and they are not even sure, now they feel even lesser than less than. Now it's like, oh, this second language learner, I should know this. They have this should right in their brain saying, I should know this. So now I feel even less capable of helping somebody. It may lead to masking their own ability. When the second language learner starts to shut down because they feel unhelpful and intimidated, the heritage language learner, what do? Well, they start simplifying things. They start pretending they don't know, right? To show solidarity. So now they're masking their abilities. Is that really helpful for them? I'm hoping we can all agree that it's not. And then the recent study that I did with a survey, second language learners were much more amenable to the idea of helping someone with lower proficiency than the heritage language learners. In fact, none of the heritage language learners say that they would like that scenario. 2 of them, of the 44, I think, said, I could do it if I have to. Only 2 of them, the rest said, no, I want to work with somebody who's at my level or above. The second language learners, the opposite, at my level or below. So it's interesting that they just have different preferences in terms of the perceived proficiency of their partner. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So these are just a couple quotes to bring home that point of the myth of the expert. So from my 2022 study, one student said, as a native speaker, I prefer improving my own Spanish rather than helping a non-native speaker. I should feel like a student in class rather than an extra helper. So if those words resonate with you, that's why I included that quote, and I still keep it in my mind, right? Not all of them, many of them do not enjoy being that extra helper, even if your intentions are good. And then from my 2015 study, this is a quote that just broke my heart. The student said, I hated the fact that I knew more Spanish. It felt uncomfortable because I think I made my partner uncomfortable. And the last thing we want is for them to say, I hated the fact that I knew more Spanish. Okay, next slide. I know I'm running out of time. So the latest study that I did, that survey, also looked at their perceptions in terms of mixed classes versus separate tracks. And I can summarize it in these 3 points. The second language learners like mixed classes, but mainly for their own benefit. They like learning words, they like learning slang, they like getting help with homework and assignments. That's why they say they like the mixed classes. The heritage language learners, some of them like them, but they say that they like them because they need to learn proper Spanish. And this is a sign of internalized stigmatization, right? That they have internalized that their Spanish is wrong, that home Spanish is wrong, and now I need to learn the proper Spanish, which you only learn in the second language classes. And then the heritage language learners were more likely to prefer the separate tracks once they have had that chance to experience the heritage courses. So if in your institution you're thinking, well, but we did a survey and they say they don't mind, they say they like them, just think about it. Have they had a chance to understand and experience what it's like to have a course tailored to heritage language learners? Okay, and the last slide that I have, no, I have one more, sorry. So to think about some of the sources of friction in mixed classes, there's been studies looking at this issue of who belongs, who doesn't belong in the class. And this comes also from how we portray classes. If we say this class is for second language learners, and then maybe I'll help you. Well, you're sort of sending a message that some of them belong and some of them are like the add-ons, but they don't really belong there. So we need to be careful with that. And of course, there's friction in terms of expectations and fairness. Heritage language learners feel pressure from both the instructors and the classmates, whether that's true or not, that's how they feel. They suspect unfair treatment. They think that we are holding them to higher standards than their second language peers in the same class. And they feel the second language learners feel that the heritage students have an unfair advantage, right? They already know Spanish. They're here for the easy A. We need to confront these myths, even with our students, not just with each other, but with our students too. Okay, and the last slide, I know I'm out of time. So one question is, oh, this has changed a little bit. Okay, so do the positives outweigh the negatives? You may be thinking that, right, in order to decide. To me, the real question is, can we ignore the negatives? Can the negatives be ignored? And I think in this case, no, we cannot ignore them. So even if separate classes are not feasible, and this is why we're here, why would we continue favor only one group of students? Okay, and now, finally, the last slide. We need to move away from thinking of mixed classes as tailored L2 courses or courses for the L2 learners where the HL learners happens to enroll. And I want to close with this quote, meeting the affected needs of all students can only be accomplished if their pedagogical needs are also met, which goes beyond classroom techniques and grouping strategies and actually requires an overhaul of course content and goals. Even if that sounds daunting, at the very least, let's start thinking about how we can re-envision mixed classes to be sort of like classes. So we stop thinking of it's an L2 class and now I have to make adjustments for the heritage speakers. What if we just rethink the class itself, the classes for both, right? We stop looking at them as the traditional curriculum for the L2 with some add-ons. All right, I'll leave it there.
First, we want to thank Maria and Victoria for the invitation to present our work. And thank you, Florencia, for providing us the background to our research and to what we propose. So if we go on to the next slide, here you see in the screen really common goals that you're all familiar with, the 5 typical C's. What we want to point out is what's in the next, animation. We have animation, so we're going to work with what we have here. So here we want to point out that many of these 5 C's are really similar to the goals of heritage language pedagogy. If we look at the first bullet point and the last bullet point, we have language maintenance, and we also have language language acquisition or the development of cultural awareness, which connects to the A and E of the 5 C's. So we want to point out that in reality, the goals of both types of classes are really similar. So why not design a course that starts from the beginning with this in mind? How could we meet both the needs of the heritage language student and the needs of the L2 students? And at the same time, how do we recognize what are the skills that each of these students bring into the classroom? So we want to propose 2 different pedagogical approaches that could be implemented from the get-go for these mixed method classes. So we go on the next slide. We have differential instruction, and this is an approach that not only is implemented in HL, it could definitely be implemented in heritage language classes and L2 classes. And the reality is that most of our classes are mixed. So why not start from designing these classes with these pedagogical approaches? And you can see on the screen, we have all these different animals, and we're all expecting them to do one thing, but they all have different skills and they all have different needs. So starting a class where we recognize what are the different needs of these students, it's important to be able to implement a top-down instruction approach, which is the second approach that we want to propose implementing in mixed method classes, which is the HL. The top-down instruction is the most effective way to take in consideration what are the needs of the students. And how we're implementing this top-down instruction approach is where we start an activity with a context. And you're gonna see the activities that my colleague is gonna present. We're gonna start the activity with a reading. So how is that reading gonna provide us a context to be able to understand that the activities that's going to continue in the following slide. But in the next slide, we want to highlight that although these 2 different pedagogical approaches could be implemented with either reading activities, writing activities, speaking activities, we are going to provide you some examples for teaching vocabulary in mixed methods classes. Teaching vocabulary in reality is really important, and we need to also emphasize it because this is a key element to the foundation of Spanish or any language learning. And we want to point out that, for instance, the heritage language learner has many weaknesses and also strengths. And this is just in generally speaking. We want to point out that this does not necessarily fit all heritage language students, but we know that mostly heritage language students come mostly familiar with home vocabulary in informal registers, especially this is the case for students that did not take any Spanish classes throughout their entire life. Most of them want to use Spanish with their family, which explains why many of them might not have the orthography, might not be familiar with the orthography, especially with those Spanish words that are really uncommon. Even native speakers make a lot of mistakes with some of these orthographies, like the H, the difference between the V, the other V. And overall, what we want to point out is many heritage language students come with a larger vocabulary than L2 students or their L2 classmates. If we click next, also heritage language learners are really different, and L2 students also come with their own weaknesses and strengths. Most of these students come with or are more familiar with vocabulary in the academic settings that are also used in formal registers. But they might be familiar because they learned it at school or in an academic setting. They might be more familiar with the orthography, but not necessarily are they going to be able to use this vocabulary in spontaneous communication. If we hit next. But when teaching vocabulary, there are many challenges. And one is that in the beginning and intermediate level textbooks are designed to meet the needs of L2 learners and not heritage language students, as Florencia mentioned. More specifically, are not meant to meet the heritage language students' affective and linguistic needs. And obviously, these books are not designed or intended to be used in mixed classes. Second, another challenge is that the vocabulary presented in the textbook often do not reflect the heritage language home variety. And these 2 challenges are what my colleague is going to point out, and how could we address these 2 challenges in the activities that we're going to be presenting next.
Hi, everybody. So given the situation that Angelica has just described, what I'm going to present now is an example of how we have adapted an activity from our first year Spanish textbook, which is a textbook clearly designed for second language learners, like most first year textbooks. And we have adapted then in order to incorporate the needs of the heritage language learners in our mixed classes, and also to try to leverage the complementary skills that Angelica just pointed out. So basically the goal is to illustrate how we can use the resources that we already have and with relatively little effort, adapt them to implement differentiated teaching in our mixed classes. So what you see here is the activity in our textbook. We have chosen the topic of food because it's a topic that appears in every first year textbook. And here you see that there is a written test that introduces the new vocabulary. Students are asked to work first individually, then in pairs. There are vocabulary questions, comprehension questions, discussion questions, which is quite typical of most textbooks. And next, please. And this is how we have adapted it, okay? So first, we ask our heritage and our second language learners to work independently so that each learner can work on their own needs. If you look on the left, the heritage language learner in steps 1 and 2, the heritage language learner is asked to compare the vocabulary in the textbook with the vocabulary that they use at home. And in step 3, they are asked to identify the main ingredients of the gastronomy of their community. And it's up to the learner to decide which community is this, with which community they identify. So this sequence of 3 individual activities have 2 main purposes. First, they offer an opportunity for the heritage language learner to increase their vocabulary. The vocabulary presented in the test, in this case, is Peruvian vocabulary. Secondly, and most importantly, they open a space to integrate in the classroom the home vocabulary of the heritage language learner. And I'm going to get back to this in a moment. If you look to the second block, the second language learner in the meantime is completing a set of 3 parallel activities that allow them to work on their own vocabulary problems, which obviously should be different, or presumably should be different from those of the heritage language learner. Next. And so once they have work on their own needs is when they come together to work in pairs, and ideally we will have mixed pairs, but these activities can also, like if you have an invariable number of heritage and, sorry, an uneven number of heritage and second language learners, they can also be matched pairs. Anyway, so first, they come together to work in pairs, and first we ask them to compare the words they have in their list so they can learn from each other, and also to share these words with the class. And this is when the home vocabulary of the heritage language learner becomes the vocabulary of the class. So the goal here is to incorporate and to validate the home variety of the heritage language learner. And to truly validate it, we needed to give it the same status as the variety presented in the textbook. That is, these words that our heritage language learners share with the rest of the class, and that are going to be different in every class because they depend on who our heritage language learners are. These words need to be treated at the same level as the vocabulary presented in the textbook. They need to be part of the contents of the chapter. They need to be part of the vocabulary list the students will be tested on. And then we have these steps 5 and 6. We ask our learners to find a Latino grocery store online and to plan a trip to the store. So our students are college students, but this is definitely something that you can also do with high schoolers. And finally, we ask them to write a review based on what they have observed. What products do they offer in this store? Is Spanish used in the store? When, where, how, by whom? So a couple of things to notice here. First, the review is written collaboratively. That is, the 2 learners, the heritage and second language learner, write 1 review. And this is important because we know that collaborative writing, when done appropriately, encourages collaboration, encourages learners to pool their individual knowledge and resources, to pool their complementary skills and strengths so they can both learn from each other. And second, the activity incorporates this aspect of getting outside the classroom that for Angelica and me is really important. The goal here is to raise our learners' awareness, both heritage and second language learners' awareness about the presence and the use of the language around them. So the goal is to differentiate the language. The thing with the Spanish and with first year, second year Spanish textbooks intended for second language learners is that they always invariably present the Spanish as a foreign language. A language that you will use when you travel abroad, if you ever travel abroad. But the truth is that you don't need to travel abroad to use Spanish or Mandarin or Vietnamese or to experience the Hispanic culture or the Chinese culture. You can use the language here. We are in Washington State. The Latinx population here is not very large, and yet pretty much in every town, there's going to be a grocery store or a church or a library or a community center or a restaurant where Spanish is spoken. And that's the idea behind these 2 last activities. So next, please. So just key takeaways or key strategies. Well, we hope that this small example has given you some ideas to help you implement differentiated teaching in your classrooms, to help you make the most of the resources you already have, whether it's a textbook or teaching materials, and with relatively little effort, adapt them to first incorporate and validate the home vocabulary and varieties, the home varieties of the heritage language learners in the classroom. Second, create opportunities for learners, for both heritage and second language learners, to work on their individual needs. Third, integrate speaking and writing. Four, use what Maria Carreira has referred to as flexible grouping in order to leverage those complementary skills of the heritage and the second language learners as much as possible. And finally, to legitimize local communities, to showcase the use of the heritage language in the US in order to differentiate the language curriculum. And next, in our case, we do this by taking the language out and beyond the classroom, by opening opportunities for learners, for the heritage language learners, but also for the second language learners to use and maintain the language as part of their everyday lives. And that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm so honored to be able to present amongst all of these great people, but I have some things to add a little bit to what my co-presenters have been saying about K through 8. And we, if you go to the next slide, we've seen like a real increase since we have seen more dual language programs coming up around the country as well. So even more learning Spanish at a younger age, and also an opportunity for our bilingual students to interact in this same sort of way, even as early as kindergarten and first grade. So this is a daily framework that actually I have adapted from one from Tina Hargaden. And really, I think in elementary classes, this becomes a way to kind of like organize the class and help them know what's coming next. And especially when you're getting into the language learning part of it, to really give them kind of what's coming up next. So there's just an example of what you might do in your classroom if you were looking to incorporate this in the lower grades. Okay. So the main part of it that I think is the most important part of the framework is the write and discuss, which I'm sure you have seen many times before, but I have seen, especially with younger learners, that they really do internalize the writing and internalize the vocabulary and are able to share a little bit more when you make this a really important part of your daily instruction with them. So instead of just having it something that you do every now and then, I am really intentional about incorporating shared writing. So not where I am writing and they are watching, where we are creating this together. So in my classes, and I think this was said before, there are some classes where I have now been able to fortunately create a heritage learner program and have them separated from the other language learners, as I'm sure we all know is a best practice. But I know that that's not the reality for everyone. So in this time when you are writing and discussing, I think it's really important that, you know, a lot of times if you have mixed classes, you would have some people kind of blurt out things before everyone else has a chance to do it. So really having this be a shared experience and differentiating, not giving the heritage learners more, but giving them something different to do during that time. And as you saw in the previous slide, if you want to go back and look at those, you can see that you have maybe a reading workshop that you work with a little bit more closely, the second language learners than you would with the heritage learners, depending on the type of class that you have. All right, so you can look at this later as well. Okay, if you go to the next one. So when I was looking at what to present and share with you all, because there's so much and there's so little time, but I wanted to kind of go off of what the previous presenters were talking about vocabulary differentiation, especially at the K-8 level. So adding words that they don't know how to spell, obviously, I think she talked about this as well, Angelica, about orthography being a nemesis, so to speak, of our heritage language learners, but giving them a chance to see that. And that's part of what Write and Discuss does, that they're saying it to you and you're able to write it in front of them. I use a camera most of the time, a document camera, and they're able to see me write it. And they're like, oh, it has an H at the beginning. Oh, I didn't know that was a C and not an S. And so those kinds of things, I think you are able to really see more when you have that daily practice of writing with them. But I think that in the cognitive content dictionary, which is that part you see at the top, this allows me to personalize the learning for every student, right? So that even if you're in a mixed class or if you're in a heritage language class, which honestly in our heritage language classes, we have students who are still, you know, very beginning intermediates, and we have some who are advanced, all in the same class. So just because they're in a heritage language class doesn't mean that their fluency is the same. You're working with varied ability levels in the language at that point as well. So I use a lot of Marzano's techniques and vocabulary expansion, similar to ELA strategies, just you know, SLA instead. So drawing, not translating. I don't need them to be able to anchor it to another word. I want them to have something that makes them think about it. And like I said, this does allow for personalizing their learning pathways. They get to choose what goes in their cognitive content dictionary. So when we're going over a list of words that they're supposed to know, we allow them the choice to put in their personal dictionary what they need to remember. And I don't assume that every student needs to know every single word on the list. They may already know those. I try to make sure that I incorporate their differentiation in their reading passages and focus on that academic vocabulary and context, as they do have usually a very strong ability to communicate, right? But the reading and being able to read a little bit higher level, maybe being able to learn some of that academic vocabulary as well is generally helpful to them in reaching that biliteracy phase, because that's what we want to try to get them to, is to be biliterate, not to lose one language or the other, but to really be biliterate students and to use their abilities, you know, as an advantage, which is what it is. And then defining words through practicing circumlocution. I love doing this for them, is getting them to tell me what the word means without saying the word. So we play a lot of different games and things, and I have even done this with my high schoolers, and they really loved it when I said, okay, you can't say the word. There are a lot of games out there that already have this strategy kind of working for them, but it helps them when I say, I want you to define these 5 words, but you can't use those words. And it's amazing what they're able to come up with. So when you're considering, you know, the mixed classes, I would really encourage you to use gifted learner strategies, much like you do in a mixed class of anything, if it's social studies or if it's science. You have different ability levels within the same class. You don't teach them all the same thing. You allow for some differentiation. You meet them where they are. You don't assume that they're at a certain level, and you don't assume they're higher. So I really think focusing on having different, not more, is important, and it makes them feel valued as well. All right. So I just wanted to add a little bit more on the cognitive content dictionary, because I kind of went over it very fast. So I give them this how-to at the beginning. It is very elementary, but it's because it's for elementary. So I give them this and I teach them exactly, like, I want them to write the word down, which helps them with their orthography. I want them to write a picture that they think represents that. It could be a picture, it could be a symbol, it could be any drawing representation. I want them to come up with some related words, some words that they think are related to that word, and either an opposite or a comparison. And I have them fill out a few of these pages, the one on the right, together, and then I allow them to start adding these kinds of things into their cognitive content dictionary. And it's amazing to see how their vocabulary grows exponentially when you bring in those related words, when you have them also think of opposites or about what it's not, or comparing it to something else. And they are really able to expand the vocabulary quickly doing that. And they kind of think it's fun. All right, so basically a daily framework can establish some routines and help to maximize your learning time. Writing daily together promotes biliteracy and solidifies that vocabulary. Vocabulary differentiation can increase the level of academic vocabulary. Remember, different, not more. And the cognitive content dictionary, I think, is a really great way to provide personalized learning pathway with especially regards to heritage language learners and their varying abilities even within one class. All right, thank you so much.
Okay, Maria is going to come on and field the questions. Everyone, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and then Maria will select the questions and direct them to the panelists. Are you still with us, Maria?
Yes, I'm right here. Thank you to the panelists for the wonderful presentations, great deal of detail and very useful information. So I'm going to start out with I'm having problems seeing the chat, actually, for some reason. Victoria, can you see? There was a question.
I can see the chat.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Do you hover? If you hover across the bottom, it might pop up for you.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, but for some reason it's just not coming up.
Okay, well, I can give you a question. One of my students is in the room, so he is learning how to teach, and he's a heritage speaker himself. He grew up bilingual, and he's wondering, this is Philip Hoskins, he's wondering, how do you provide that I+1 when you have people who are monolingual, beginning language learners, and then you have heritage learners with much higher levels of, speaking and listening proficiency? So maybe our panelists could address how do we do that?
Do we go in any particular order, or do we just jump in?
Jump in.
I know my answer is probably going to be very annoying, but it's going to be inspired by what Kim Potosky always says, which is like, if you have a heritage speaker who already has a relatively good level, a good basic command, if you want to call it, of communicative abilities in Spanish, meaning they can understand you on the types of topics that you talk about in Spanish 1, and they can produce the types of topics in Spanish 1 speaking, that student should not be in Spanish 1. I mean, I know it's going to be an annoying answer, but it's just, I think it's more systematic that the system needs to help the student. We wouldn't put a native speaker of English in an ESL 101 class. Why are we doing this to native Spanish speakers? Heritage speakers are native speakers. And so I think that would be my first thing, is to see how different the levels truly are. If we're talking about somebody who grew up speaking Spanish, that student should not be in Spanish 1. There's only so much differentiation can do. It's not meant to be put students anywhere you want and just differentiate. That's not the message that we're sending here. I think that there needs to be a good placement in place to begin with, and then understanding that, yes, at some point, they might be in a Spanish 4, they might be in AP, right? And you might have heritage and non-heritage together. And then, I can see some of the things that were shared today that could be adapted for differentiation. Now, you might have a student who is receptive bilingual, meaning they can understand you, but when it comes to even speaking, they draw a blank, right? Like they say they don't know how to say anything. Well, then maybe in that case, they might need actually some of that. What I would probably say is maybe differentiate the written input and tailor it that way, and try to find ways that maybe you cannot differentiate everything, of course, but maybe there could be some choice in some or many of the assignments that you give. And so the student could feel a little bit more in control of their own learning and what they feel comfortable tackling at that time.
Thank you, Florence. Yeah, anybody else? Any other panelists?
I also want to point out that many times heritage language students, if they have the option to go to the track, many times they enroll in this lower level Spanish classes because many times they feel that they don't speak good Spanish. So they have to go to the basic level. So I think it would be really helpful to implement diagnostic tests so that way you can see if these students really belong in that class. So you can sometimes interview with them, because there's many factors of why heritage language students decide to enroll in L2 classes, right? In the beginning classes and not enrolled in the upper classes. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Angelica. So we have a very important question and a difficult one from Tierney. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Cow. And she says, all heritage language learners covered in today's talk speak Spanish. How about in language classrooms of non-cognate languages in which the ratio of heritage learners is lower? Is it worth the effort and the energy to change tasks for those 1 to 2 students?
If I may, that's actually our situation, because at the University of Washington, we do have a heritage language program. So most of heritage language learners, those who can speak, they go to the heritage language program. So in our first and second year Spanish language classes, typically in a class with 25 students, we have 1 or 2, maybe 3 students who are heritage language learners. And some of them is the situation that we just mentioned, where maybe they can understand, but they don't speak. Some of them have a cultural connection, but they don't know the language, but others, they do also can speak. So we have all these different, and it definitely, if it's just for 1 or 2 students, it is still necessary. But it's a challenge, and it's very difficult. And I mean, like, we are still struggling with this situation, because one thing is the ideal situation where you have half and half, and another thing is when you have 1 and 2. I think that at least some of the strategies that we have presented can also be used in those classes. I cannot talk about those languages that don't use the same alphabet, because I don't have experience with that. But I believe that many of these strategies can be used. One thing that we use and that works a lot is flipped classroom. So a lot of activities where sometimes there has to be some pre-work at home, and that's where it's very easy or it makes it easier to assign different activities to different groups of students. They are working at home on different things, and then when they come to class, they have done this preparation that prepares them to somehow be able to collaborate at a more balanced level. But well, I just wanted to recognize that there is a challenge. It's very difficult when you have 1 or 2 students, but it's definitely still worthy. And I believe that there are still things that we can do, and it's never going to be ideal. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be like having them in a heritage language class. But I think that some of the ideas we presented can definitely be implemented. We are implementing them in classes with 1 or 2 heritage language learners.
I'll just jump in very briefly, because Carol Ann Tomlinson, who is the mother of differentiated instruction, has this non-negotiables of a differentiated classroom. And one of those is that every student counts. That means every student must get something out of the lesson, and every student must contribute something to the classroom. So those are non-negotiables. You want to do everything you can to reach every single student, maybe in a small way. It doesn't mean everybody gets the same thing. Anybody else want to add? Any of the other panelists want to add to this question, or should I move on to the next question?
I mean, I think it depends. the question was specifically about other languages, so not Spanish. And
Right.
I don't have experience with other languages, unfortunately, so I don't know what they're doing. I see Ji-Young Anha in the audience, and she's the director of the Korean language program, and she has been doing a lot of work with heritage speakers. So Ji-Young, if you want to chime in the chat, I'm volunteering you to share your experiences. But it is difficult right now, just in terms of numbers, but then in terms of the language itself, right? So I think that in Spanish, we can do some things, or even in college, we get second language learners that have had some Spanish, right? Like it's just a little bit different versus, you know, starting truly from zero and without cognates. And the kind of teaching that you need to do for those students and the heritage language learners are just already, you know, way above that. And so it's definitely challenging. The only thing that I can think of, if it is higher ed, I'm not sure what the context is to perhaps consider some sort of hybrid course, right? So that at least some of the online modules can be a little bit more tailored for the students. And then find a way of differentiating somehow in class, or offering what we do here, that is the same course, but there is an online option for the heritage students. So they can choose to take the course online. They don't have to come to class. And so I know that it's tricky to think about it, and it involves some development, but just something to consider, that sometimes technology can help us with things like this, and changing the format, making something a little bit more tailored to that student, but self-paced online.
I think it
Maria-
was, oh yeah, sure, of course. 1 second. I just want to mention that Anna mentioned the flip format, and that works well in a mixed classroom because you can really differentiate instruction outside the classroom. I'm sorry, Alana, go on.
Well, there were a couple of things. The flipped classroom, if you're talking about, you know, college level, then that works well. But I have noticed that in most of the schools that I've worked in that have been, you know, Title I schools, they don't always have access to technology outside of school. So flipping the classroom isn't always an option if you're talking about K-12. So I understand that that is something in post-secondary, but it's not always something that is available to students. And sometimes that's beyond their control, right? But as far as the other languages, we did have a Chinese teacher at our school, and she had several heritage learners, recent arrivals actually, in her class, and where she was also teaching level 1. And she incorporated a lot of the daily framework that I mentioned, and just differentiated each of those things. So like found higher level readings for them to do during the same reading time. So instead of reading with her and doing those kinds of things with the, I'm gonna butcher this, but is it pinging? Is that what it's called? When it's like the written form of Chinese, I think it's called that. I'm sorry, I'm probably messing that up. But anyway, she would do that with the level 1s, and then this other student would, oh, it is pinging. Yay, I did it right. Okay, but she would also have them reading more challenging during that time. So they were still using the reading time, and they were still in the writing time. So you can incorporate some of these strategies. It is possible when there's even 1 or 2 students, and doing something like having kind of a formulaic day helps, especially with, you know, younger learners.
And that relates to a question that was directed at you, Alana. Can these strategies be applied with the small ones? I mean, first graders. The same thing, but related to the context that should be presented to contextualize the content. Good, thank you.
Yes, definitely. So I use that. We have several, especially in like dual language classes and things like that. And I love the framework idea because it helps kids have like I even have it posted in the room so that they know exactly what's coming and when it's coming, and they know like what they're going to do next. So they kind of have a frame going into it as well. And yes, it absolutely works to do a lot of these things, maybe not working independently as much like some of the other suggestions. can't really like send the first grader off on their own when they're not literate in their own language. So you kind of have to allow for literacy to happen a little bit after that, but for the reading part anyway.
Thank you. And I think this might be the last question we have time for. It's an interesting one and a difficult one to answer. It comes from Dionysia Di Meo, and she says, you might have a fluent in speaking HL, but he or she might be weak in reading and writing. Where do you place this student? And I'm going to add, what do you do with this student after you place them, him or her? So maybe I'll jump in. Definitely somebody who's fluent in speaking the AHL should not be in a beginning language class, right? So we can, am I right to assume that we all agree that they should be in an intermediate level class by the time they can speak fluently?
I think it depends a lot on the goals of the course in the program, right? But yeah, I mean, definitely. And the issue, as you know it very well, right, that a lot of the placement tests sometimes don't really reflect
right.
which course they should be in, because the courses are targeting something different than the modality of the test and all that, right? So there's issues with that.
Right.
So this is why I think Jessica made the comment, or maybe Marta, I'm sorry. I think Marta made the comment of, it is our responsibility, not the students. And I think that's key. Right. So we are the trained professionals. We shouldn't just blame the advisor. We shouldn't just blame the counselor. Right. If we're there with the students, or even if we're working with teaching assistants, then we need to train our teaching assistants to come to us and say, hey, I think, this level, this course is just a little bit too, too low for this student, not challenging enough. And then let's help that student. It's going to depend on every program. In my university, for example, students can switch to any course they want, and I know that may not be the case in every university. So in my case, yeah, if I meet with a student, I determine you're ready for 300 level, go ahead and sign up.
Right.
That's easy, right? Yeah.
Right. But the question is, and we don't have time to answer it here, I think, is that if you put them in an intermediate class, at that point, the L2 learners can read and write, and maybe the HL learner can. So obviously we have to differentiate sort of in the way that all the panelists have told us about activities that involve writing at different levels for L2 learners, for HL learners, as well as speaking at different levels, because when it comes to speaking, the HL learner will be ahead of the L2 learner. And now I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions, but hopefully we can continue this conversation in the aftermath. There's wonderful post activities to this critical conversation evening. I'm going to turn it over to Celia, who's going to tell us about how to do that.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists. Next slide, please. So I'm Celia Chamon-Zamora. I'm the Director of Professional Learning and Certification. And the wonderful news is that all of this is not done. There are definite next steps, and there's more work to be done. Next slide, please. So we're going to encourage you to continue the conversation in our ACTFL community. The ACTFL community is open to everybody. All you need is just to join with your email. You do not have to be a member, although we are always happy and ecstatic to have new members at ACTFL, but you are able to access the community and the conversation without having to pay anything. There you will find the recording of this webinar, as well as some guiding questions from our panelists and a discussion board for you to collaborate with other educators who were here in this panel who want to continue to work with heritage language learners. If you have any questions in trying to log in or trying to find the community, we definitely ask you to email membership@actfl.org. Next slide, please. There you will go to myactfl.org/critical combos. If you have an ACTFL account already, all you need to do is log in. And then you can also access it there from your drop-down menu. Next slide, please. And the discussion board will be monitored by all of you. ACFL will not necessarily be involved in the logistics of planning the conversations or any follow-ups or products or any subsequent meetings that come out of this, but we will be checking in every now and then just to kind of see how it's going and to help you with any projects that you are thinking of creating or any of the guiding questions. Once you do have a product that's completed, because we hope that out of this conversation, something comes out of it. And I will show you in the next slide what a product could typically look like. You would email it to plc@acfl.org, and there we can discuss how to make it available on our website, of course, giving you credit. So it's a great way for you to build up your resume, build up really your network and your connections to be able to continue helping the field, as well as helping you develop as a professional. Next slide, please, Nadia. And some sample products. So some of the things that we saw, from example, diversifying the teacher pipeline or barriers to certification. We could have a sample project such as creating letter templates, outlining alternatives for certification that could be shared with your state, with your district, with the nation, really. Also creating recruitment materials for teachers of underrepresented communities to be used by stakeholders to bring in more interested parties into teaching. And this could be targeted for less commonly taught languages, indigenous communities, and so forth. And creating FAQs for potential teacher candidates whose L1 is not English to simplify the certification process for them. So these are just some sample products that could come out of these critical conversations. And we look forward to seeing you in the community, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celia. I know some of the panelists also have mentioned that they will be sharing some of their activities that on these next steps. So I hope that all of you will engage with them as well after this webinar ends. Just quickly to remind you that the early bird registration deadline is coming up. So please go ahead and register for the ACFL conference in Boston, the convention and World Languages Expo, November 18th through 20th. It's going to be hybrid this year, so you can participate virtually, or you can come in person to Boston. And that early bird registration ends on July 13th. Of 2022. So please come, and we have these wonderful keynote speakers, Chef Jose Andres, Dr. Keisha Blaine, and Wajahat Ali. And then finally, the last slide, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and please get involved and stay engaged in this topic. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in August. Have a wonderful summer, everyone.